I mean, so 10 years in the Olympics, and then you got headhunted from the Olympics in Canada to the Olympics here, and then to the NFL. Like,
Yes.
talk about that. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, as you know, in our world in sport, it's kind of like who you know and who knows you. And in the Olympic world, it's a lot about looking for other people with Olympic experience, and oftentimes that's really just looking globally. So my sport background personally is combat sports, and so the U.S. Olympic Committee was looking for a combat sport dietitian, which physiologically is like the most fun population to work with weight cutting and getting that right. So they had hunted me down, and it was a great population. It was my passion kind of area to work in. And then, as you know, it's just kind of you start to meet people, and I had been in a few articles in the media, and somehow somebody from the New Orleans Saints invited me to come and kind of evaluate their sport nutrition program and physiology kind of program, and there wasn't one, and so that kind of parlayed into consulting for them, and then that parlayed into somebody from that team leaving to become the GM of the Bears and recruiting me over there. And it was a fun time in the NFL. I actually left to go for the schedule because I was like, wow, I don't have to be on a plane 250 days
Yeah.
a year. I could just get to go every other weekend for a night in a charter. This sounds awesome. So it was definitely a fun opportunity to build a program from like literally nothing, and just to get to experience that world for a really long time.
That's awesome. How did you have roles where sports science coordinator and dietitian? How does that work
Yeah.
out? Like, how do you handle the two worlds?
Yeah, so for me, that's all. I've always had that dual role because my education was, I did a traditional, Bachelor of Science in Nutrition, dietetic internship, worked kind of in the dietetic world. But then when I went back to do my master's, I did a pure 100% ex-phys master's, like a separate master's. It wasn't a combined program with nutrition. And so basically did a pure, applied physiology stream, worked in a physiology lab when I was doing that. And so that kind of lended itself into the duality of my practice over the years where, like I say to some of my interns, I can go from writing a menu for a team to analyzing GPS reports, and my brain's just been trained to go both ways that way, and so it's just a byproduct of how I came up in the system.
I mean, that's impressive that you could, be doing both, but at the same time, it's probably beneficial because if you're working with strength and conditioning coaches or sport coaches and it's different times of the year, then you can interpret what the data means for the amount of workload that they're doing, and then,
Yep.
try to properly prescribe the nutrition that would help them with that certain phase. Is that things you were doing?
Yeah, and really I think like just having a sound understanding of applied physiology and testing and how you can kind of incorporate that. And that it all kind of, we all kind of work in these areas where there's kind of crossover, so if I'm responsible for what's going into my athlete's body, then I should be able to measure. I should be able to measure that. I should be able to know how to use an RMR cart or measure VO2 max or measure sweat sodium. Measure sweat sodium from the from the sweat, or understand lab values, and then again work at those external and internal load measurement tools, and understand how that impacts not only caloric expenditure but stress on the body and within the training cycle, how that fits in. So I feel like it's just a natural connection, and whether or not you truly practice like how I have in both worlds, it's really important for both sides to kind of have a good understanding of how they operate.
You mentioned it with the hydration and the sweat rate. How, for our listeners out there that maybe don't have as high level,
Yeah.
education as you do, what would be some of the best recommendations to measure hydration and sweat rate testing?
Yeah, so the most important thing to remember is that, first of all, every single athlete is an individual when it comes to this. So if you're working in a program and you're giving blank recommendations or like generic recommendations for everybody, then it's pretty much the same thing as telling everybody on your team that they need to eat a 2,000 calorie diet, like you see kind of, recommended from the FDA, So remember, for hydration, if you're in that position where you're just giving like, oh, you need to have 2 liters of water a day, like you're really, really missing the mark, because hydration status and losses are very individually determined and usually just set genetically. So the other thing to remember is that measuring it is a comprehensive approach. And so I've taught a few lectures. It's called 360 hydration assessment. And so what that involves is you have to get a measure of fluid loss, which you can easily do through a pre and post weigh-in situation. Ideally, you want to be able to measure what's been consumed, but you don't necessarily have to do that. And you really want to make sure you're trying to standardize the clothing and what the players are wearing before and after, because you've probably experienced this too. You get a guy that weighs out with his sweaty gear on, or even just some extra pads, and you've messed your whole calculation up. But in addition to that, that's just telling you about the fluid loss, right? We're not actually looking at the composition of that fluid and what's going on with that athlete's sweat, and are they truly a salty sweater, and can we do a sodium intervention if it's needed for them? So that's where the next level of that is, and what I've done in different sports, different ways, but you kind of would potentially do sweat testing with your entire squad, or maybe just your high-risk guys, whereby you would put a sweat patch on them, collect a sweat sample, analyze it using there's some really nice, easy devices you can use for that. I use the Laquatwin Hariba system, get a measure of sweat sodium, and then from there can determine, again, where you can then kind of determine not only how much fluid does this athlete need to consume, but then should I add additional electrolytes to that fluid, and in what amount? And then on top of all of that, the third level of hydration assessment, if we really want to nerd out, is looking at the physiology of heat and the impact of that on your athlete. And remembering that part of why we sweat is because we're creating internal heat. And that heat can be exacerbated by external heat like the sun or humid conditions. And so there's interventions you can partake to control that, right? And so that would be things like ice vests, or dipping the hands in ice water, or using some of those hand cooling devices, or even just we used to do it with the football players, just ice towels around their head and neck to cool the actual thermostat down. And so if you do 1 and 2 but forget the third, you're battling a physiological response that you know what I mean? You could drink all the water in the world, but if the person's still overheating from a core temperature sense, that's another piece. So it's always a reminder that, like, you know, we can go really deep, and I've gone really deep, and it's really, really fun if you're into physiology. But just remember, if you're at that level where you're kind of just saying, everyone drink 2 liters a day, like, we can go deeper than that.
So I do want to go deeper with that. And as you were talking about it, I've done some sweat rate testing with a company before, and we'll do that. We'll put the patch on their arm. We'll go through a training session, very similar to get it, and then we'll analyze it. This is how much fluid, this is how much of it is, sodium. So I'm sticking with you on all that.
Yeah.
The first thing I want to ask about is, you mentioned the temperature in which you do it. So if you do that sweat rate testing on a day that's maybe hotter, more humid, first question, is that going to be invalid data than if it was just a outlier in terms of how hot it was?
That's a really, really good question. The short answer is not really, because while that environmental temperature will impact the fluid loss, so how much sweat they actually produce overall, the sweat sodium concentration is very, very much kind of just a set to who you are as an individual.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.